The organization of international production has developed into a global value chain with numerous supplier firms worldwide. The activities of this chain can produce both positive and negative effects, some of the negative effects contributing to significant challenges. The question is, who is best equipped to handle and manage these negative effects within these chains? At the IIBG 7th Academia Industry Exchange, hosted by Hong Kong Metropolitan University, Professor Peter W. Liesch from the University of Queensland discussed the effects of global value chains of multinational companies. He also addressed the difficulties in researching and theorizing this phenomenon.
I'm going to talk to you about externality effects, and I'm probably the bit on GVCs, and we'll be the bit on digital transformations and so on. So we cover the patch. So by way of introduction, we're all aware that in the recent past, we've experienced heightened uncertainties. And particularly in global business or cross-business exchange, those uncertainties are very real. And COVID brought that to light, and those uncertainties continue with the way the world is struggling with some major events these days. So global value chains, as an evolving form of the internationalisation of production, clearly have been affected by recent changes, and over a period of time, it seems we've moved beyond the period of unfettered globalisation, which began in the 1990s, and some people fear we've moved into this period of somewhat, to a degree, deglobalisation. I'm not quite sure about that. But what's happened is global value chains have been elevated in the consciousness of the public. And that's interesting because normally the public don't take a great deal of interest in things like how production is organised internationally. But certainly they have these days because of shortages and so on, which we've all experienced. And that's ensured that governments have had to take an interest in these global value chains too. So not only are firms and researchers, IB researchers and researchers in cognate fields taking an interest in global value chains, but the public are, and certainly governments are. So we've got issues like climate-induced crises, natural disasters. The mindfulness of sustainable development is now highlighted throughout the world. Climate change, responsible governance, these issues have taken prominence in our work. The growth of populism and economic nationalism is clearly evident. Digital technologies clearly are rapidly revolutioning our industrial and commercial landscapes, and particularly global value chains. So with the impact and frequency of these natural occurrences and this increased elevated awareness of the power and influence of the firms that orchestrate these global value chains, the multinational enterprises, the focal firms that are of particular interest in international business, scholars in IB and in other fields are in somewhat of a rivalry. They're positioning, they're jockeying for positions in what I call the worldwide market for ideas. As scholars, we are in a market for ideas, and it's a rivalrous market. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about what it means for our fields, our scholarly fields, if we're not in the forefront of some of these phenomena. So, as a type of tentative research question, I pose, how are the unintended effects of global value chains best managed? So at the outset, I'm going to talk about the less visible effects of global value chains. And are we as IB scholars well positioned in this domain of global value chain inquiry? So I've got two messages, one about industry and one about academia. So what's my motivation for this presentation? At the outset, I'll accept that we are a phenomenological field. That means we observe phenomena and we set out to explain them. That's how the field started. We've read a lot in our literature, even in the recent past, by editors of our major journals, that we remain a phenomenological field. In broad terms, the International Organisation of Production is our scholarly domain. It always was. Right at the very beginning, authors like Buckley and Casson and Dunning and Hennart and Rugman, the internalisation theorists, were all interested in multinationality, the very nature of the MNE and what it's doing overseas and how it's doing it. So the MNE was theorised very early in the emergence of the IB field. And alongside the interest in multinationality and the MNE was this interest in the internationalisation process of the firm through the Uppsala scholars. So right at the outset in IB, we've had an interest in the international organisation of production. And clearly, global value chains are the modern evolution of that internationalisation of production, or how production is organised internationally. For the last 60 odd years, we've been interested in this theme of the organisation of international production. Increasingly, we're starting to realise that this modern form, the global value chain, is terribly complex. And that complexity is making it very difficult to manage in some respects. So are we theorising the global value chain in our field, international business, strongly, producing impactful research? Buckley wrote about 20 years ago, and it's still in the forefront of people's minds, are we as a field, international business, running out of steam? If we were running out of steam 20 years ago, it's been a long running out of steam. I think it's probably still there. I guess if Peter Buckley were to write another paper, he'd write the same paper. So if we are running out of steam in our field, right, the consequences of this neglecting our remit are really serious as a field, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about a few different things about global value chains. So, for example, vehicle emissions have long been known to be problematic. For many decades, we've known that vehicle emissions cause problems for public health and so on, both a local and on a global scale. We don't talk much about vehicle emissions in IB, but clearly the firms that are producing our motor cars are big multinationals. And you might gauge that I'm going to talk about some of the unintended consequences of the organisation of production of motor vehicles. It's a worldwide phenomenon. Our oceans have been polluted from man-made waste. We don't talk about this in IB, but clearly the firms that produce the foods that end up in containers in our oceans are made by big multinationals. It's a worldwide phenomenon. For example, I've just come back from AIB Oceania conference, and we started this year. Oceania means that we're including now all the small Pacific Island nations. Well, I can tell you that the wheat that's produced in Australia, or some of the wheat that's produced in Australia, is produced into noodles in Southeast Asia, which is packaged in plastic containers, which ends up in the ocean, on the beaches of Tuvalu and so on in the South Pacific. That's an unintended consequence. Industrial waste across all industries, but particularly in agriculture, which I've taken an interest more recently. I began my career as an agricultural economist, is well known, even though global food security is jeopardised. There's a huge amount of waste in agriculture, and we'll say a little bit about that later. But the big firms that are involved in agriculture globally are multinational. Local populations are profoundly experiencing the effects of global warming. I mentioned the small Pacific. Can you imagine living in a nation where the average height above sea level is 1.8 metres? That's as tall as I am. That's the average height in Tuvalu. There are 16,000 people in that nation. So clearly they're very worried about their futures. Who's producing the effects that are causing that global warming? It's lots of entities, one of which is big multinationals. So these are worldwide phenomena. Is there some commonality amongst them? Are there common trends? Yes, they are, because these effects that are being produced in these different contexts are externality effects, unintended effects on third parties who weren't consenting to original decisions. So these are externality effects. So I've titled this slide messaging. So I've got two messages. One is to highlight the importance of these externalities, which we don't really consider in IB. And I'll summarise them and I'll come back to this later. There are bads of value chains. I'll call them bads. Inequities. There are big, powerful multinational orchestrating firms, and there are very small firms who are doing all the hard work for these multinationals. There are monopoly effects, there are monopsony effects. So there are bads in global value chains, just as there are bads in all systems of production. There are goods in global value chains. For example, to orchestrate and manage these complex chains, they've had to introduce new types of digital technologies and so on to coordinate activities across chains. And that's a good thing. That's good. It's led to innovation and development. Also, too, there's all of that interest in how global value chains can help in the development of emerging and lesser developed economies. That's a good. And then there are global value chain failures, which we don't talk about. So I don't know how you would do this, but clearly, theoretically, it exists. There's probably suboptimum throughput in all of our global value chains and of overall value created. In other words, the chains that we believe are efficient probably aren't as efficient as they might be, in that they're not producing at levels of value creation that might otherwise have been realised. In other words, there are a lot of unintended effects producing negative and positive externalities. And do we in IB really consider these? This is part of cross-border activity. It's part of global value chains. I don't think we do, but we should. Global value chains have been around for some decades now, and we know a lot about them, but I think we need to move beyond a lot of the structure, governance, relationships, coordination, control issues that we do spend our time with, and look seriously at the impacts of this system of the organisation of international production. It's going to be with us probably forever now. And if we do this, it might help us lay claim, again, reclaim possibly aspects of our domain, the international organisation of production. So I'm going to talk about externalities, and I'm going to talk about if we don't do this, this reflects not too well on our field and our positioning in this worldwide market for ideas. So first I'm going to say a little bit about reflective inquiry, which is what I'm indulging at the moment. Introspection is important. It's valuable, it's necessary to our scholarly fields. We need to be able to articulate what it is that we as IB scholars do. I always tell PhD students, when you go for your first job interview, you make sure you can concisely articulate what it is that you as an IB scholar do. And don't use the word about. It is not about. It is something or other. Is IB remaining true to its foundations? Is it remaining true to its foundations? Because it had a very healthy emergence. We are a phenomenological field. We study phenomena, MNEs and their activities across borders and their interdependencies. Are we still doing that thoroughly? Is the IB field at risk of falling into irrelevance, or is it strengthening? That was the theme of Buckley's "Are we running out of steam?" comment. Years ago, with colleagues, we did a study of the evolution of the field, and we found about 50 introspective articles published in GIBS. 50. That's a lot of articles on introspection. So IB as a group, or scholars in IB, are keen on reflecting on what's going on in the field. What is our goal? We're scholars. I don't call ourselves academics. I call us scholars. Scholars. So what is the goal of scholars? The goal of scholars is to produce interesting, influential and notable theory. And what does interesting mean? We all know that when we get responses from the journals that we submit articles to, well, this is not really interesting, or this is a really interesting piece. What does interesting mean? Here's one view. What appears to be X is really non-X. What appears to be the independent variable is really the non-independent variable. What is accepted as X is really non-X. That is, an interesting proposition is often the negation of an accepted one. So what we believe to be the case is not the case. And what's influential and notable, this is discovery of the truth. Being true and challenging in a significant way the assumptions underlying existing theory. So here I'm paraphrasing what Davis said in that very famous paper in 1971. It's interesting. The Phenomenology of Sociology, a really, really interesting paper. And really interesting and influential and notable work may be that piece that moves towards establishing a new theoretical school of thought. If you're that author, very well and congratulations. In a sense, I think that's what the Uppsala scholars were doing when they published their work on the internationalisation process of the firm. It was a deviation from the previous, probably mainstream economics view about the economic theory of the multinational. And look how long. That 1977 paper of Johansson and Valnay forever will be the most cited paper in GIBS. It will always be, even if it's blind-sighted these days. So this is our market, the pursuit of truth. And here's a quote in Coase in 1974 by a fellow called Milton. He says, "Give me the liberty to know, to utter and to argue freely according to conscience above all liberties." This is scholarship. This should be our mantra as scholars, discovery of the truth. The preparedness to argue the case, to always attempt to arrive at, ultimately, the truth. So what this, in my eyes, is talking about is this notion of problematisation, this methodology for challenging the assumptions underlying existing theory. So what is problematisation? It's a dialectical interrogation of one's own position, others' positions, and the targeted literature domain. This is the view that we question everything we write. If you write a sentence, question it to the end. This is problematisation, challenging our own views, challenging the views of the others, continually trying to arrive at the ultimate truth. But we have to be prepared to accept that challenge. We have to be prepared to accept that interrogation of our work. And I'm not sure we do that really thoroughly. So Foucault in Alverson and Sandberg said, it's an endeavour to know how and to what extent it might be possible to think differently instead of what is already known. So what's the theoretical worth of challenging an assumption to think differently? We all know this. We all know this. As we develop our careers in academia, are confronted with this question, so what? You've produced this piece of work, so what? That's obvious. So we're not interested in, but we all know this, it's obvious. That's absurd, right? We're not going to publish this, we can't publish, it's absolutely absurd. It's unbelievable, we're not going to publish that. So this is interesting, is somewhere in between the obvious and the absurd. It's interesting. So the alternative, and this is not a derogatory comment, is gap spotting. And I'm going to get to the point in a minute. Gap spotting, we all know this because we read it in our papers, we extend the literature, I'm going to address this gap in the literature. Others have not paid particular attention to this, so I'm going to do it. There's been a call for more empirical research that addresses this shortcoming, so here I go. This is gap spotting. Now that's fine, but what gap spotting does is reinforces existing theory. If you're gap spotting, you accept existing theory. You're not problematizing it, you're accepting it. And at best, you're providing for incremental development. One expression that's used to characterise that is called footnote on footnote research. So these types of works under-problematise the literature. They don't challenge the literature as such. My expression for that is, and again, it's not so direct, it's adding a wrinkle to the prune. Who cares if there's another wrinkle on the prune? But if you discover a new fruit, wouldn't that be fantastic? But adding a wrinkle to the prune is not particularly exciting. And I'll quote here from authors Daft and Ari Lewin, who in their editorial in the journal Organisation Science, so in the very first editorial in that journal Organisation Science when it came out in 1990, Daft and Lewin said, in organisation research, which was their field at the time, their view is there's a strong need for reorienting organisational research away from incremental footnote on footnote research as the norm of the field. So those original authors of org science had in their mind that they wanted to reorient org science or organisational research away from footnote on footnote research because they perceived the authors, scholars in organisational research were under-problematising the literature. So where did the IB field come from? Post-Second World War, there was an observation across many functional fields, scholars in many, of the increasing visibility of the multinational enterprise. And what it was doing, it was investing overseas. It was not just exporting from home countries, it was investing. As a group of scholars, sociologists, business historians, economists, whoever, how are these phenomena to be explained? Do we have theory that explains the very nature of this post-war multinational and FDI, the activity it was undertaking across borders? So where do you go looking for this theory? So you go to economics and you see the MNE is a firm. So is there a theory of the firm? Yes, there was. In microeconomics, there was a neoclassical economic theory of the firm. But that firm was unresponsive. It responded to market signals only. Whereas we know the MNE, and even post-Second World War, was a firm that conditioned its environment. It just didn't accept its operating environment. It determined its operating environment. And what they were doing overseas was FDI, but economics had theories of international trade, which are still theories of international trade, which are very good theories of international trade. But these firms weren't just trading, they were investing. So economics at the time, because of its neoclassical paradigm, could not explain fully the multinational and what it was doing overseas. And scholars with an interest in the multinational and what it was doing said, well, we're probably in a different domain. It's not economics anymore. And international business was seeded as a scholarly field. So it was the failures in the economics of the time wrapped in their neoclassical paradigm which did not accept imperfect international markets, which is the dominant characteristic of IB. You could characterise IB as firms operating in an environment of imperfect international markets. So IB grew out of a failure of the economics of the day to fully explain the phenomenon that were important. Now I'll say a little bit about global value chains. Clearly they're changing the organisation of international production, and we all know the benefits. We all derive the advantage of global value. We get more and more products from more and more parts of the world at a lot less cost than we ever did. So there are a lot of benefits for this system of production, but there are also costs, and the costs are very difficult to identify sometimes and particularly to measure. In particular, there are costs not always addressed by the firm undertaking the activity. In other words, there are externality effects. So I'll just highlight one example we all know about. In the automobile industry, it's been known for many, 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 many decades that internal combustion motors release toxic gases that affect public health and are a concern to populations all around the world. The United States government introduced emissions control legislation back in the 1990s, but it was a slow progression of legislation, ending up in things like catalytic converters on internal combustion engines, which treated some of those noxious gases, but they're still released. So there's very slow and incremental change. So I'll call them the legacy motor vehicle firms, the Toyotas and the Fords and the GMs and the Mercedes and the BMWs and Volkswagens, Kias and whoever. So all the legacy firms are ceded to these emissions control legislations, but no more. They would change their motor vehicle emission systems right up to the point that they're required to, but did no more. And the changes that have been introduced have been very incremental, like more efficient motor vehicles, incremental changes such as hybrid electric vehicles. So firms have been changing, yes, the legacy motor, but slowly, but no more than what was required of them by legislation in different countries until Tesla came along. And Tesla dramatically changed the dominant praxis in that industry. They produced electric motor cars. They weren't just producing cars up to the threshold of requirements by the governments around the world, but they decided to produce electric motor vehicles. And look what's happened. Look how the legacy motor vehicle firms have had to race now to perform at that same level. All of the motor vehicle firms are on this path to fully electric vehicles. So keep that in mind. What changed the dominant praxis in that industry of one of our most major global issues, emissions control from internal combustion? A firm. A firm changed it. So global value chain members are motivated to act in their own best interests. And we have to keep in mind that in these complex global value chains, there's not one firm that will know of everything that's going on in that chain. Not even the lead firm will know of everything that's happening in that chain because they're too complex. There are multi-tiered contractual arrangements that the lead firm will never know what's going on at some points. So in theory, there's no one firm that is best placed to rectify these externalities. In other words, the overall functioning, the overall optimisation of the global value system is a real challenge. It's a real challenge because of our national jurisdictions with our different legal systems that don't coordinate across borders. It's difficult because there are what I would call information impossibilities. It is just not possible in some of these complex chains for any one firm, not even the lead firm, to know of everything that's going on because we've got limited calculative capacity. So what are these externalities? Well, clearly it's an economics notion. An externality is an event that confers an appreciable benefit or inflicts an appreciable damage on some person or persons who are not fully consenting parties in reaching the decision which led directly or indirectly to the event in question. The population in Tuvalu did not have any involvement in the decisions to produce takeaway noodles in plastic containers that end up on their beaches. They probably did not have a voice in the decisions to champion internal combustion engines forever and a day to produce global warming, which has probably seen the levels of seas rise, which has affected whether they can live on their islands or not. The Economist reported a couple of years ago, supply chains have grown complex and global. As links have multiplied, so too have points of possible failure. So that implies that if they're in complex global value chains, supply chains, with multiple links, then there are probably multiple points of failure in these chains. Transactions and exchange within a global value chain in one geography may have important effects on third parties in other geographies where costs and benefits have not been incorporated in market clearing prices, therefore generating suboptimal allocation of resources. So we don't really talk a lot about this in IB. This is more economics talk. So the economists are talking about these things. In a paper recently, Peter Buckley and I presented a view that couched within internalisation perspectives and drawing upon the global integration, local responsiveness approach, that we could argue that the lead firm is best placed and can and does manage some of these complexities across national jurisdictions, not governments. And we do respect that, yes, we acknowledge firms will do locally what is necessary, but probably not anything more. And that's what the legacy motor vehicle firms have been doing for 100 years. They accept legislation, but they do no more than acceding to that legislation until Tesla came along. So in a sense, and we don't say this in the paper, but I think a bit more, what we're talking about is internalising the social conscience that appreciable damage can be inflicted upon third parties. So this is a view for the SDG type people. If we can get firms to internalise this notion of a social conscience and build it into their decision-making process, that maybe some of the activities that they are doing, if they thought about it, are creating an appreciable damage on unintended third parties. For the MNE, local priorities and global obligations will not always align, but they must be managed. So we set out and developed a framework for this. If we think about the firm is one agent within a complex chain, so we need at the outset to move beyond the firm as a unit of analysis, which has traditionally been the IB view. IB started off with the individual firm as a unit of analysis, and yes, it's progressed to other levels of analysis. But we haven't got to the point of considering the whole global value chain as a unit of analysis. We must move beyond the theory of the firm and the MNE to this higher level of analysis, the complete global value chain, if we are to take into account these unintended effects. And we believe that firms that do achieve this, like the Teslas, and we'll talk about a few others in a little while, the firms that do achieve this have some commonalities. In other words, they behave in a systematic way to take into account these unintended consequences. And to try to get at this, we adopt this thing called the awareness, motivation and capability model that has been applied in strategy. So clearly, what we're going to say is the first thing the firm needs to be aware that there is a problem. It needs to be aware that the interfirm relationships that it's got in global value chains create issues that they might not know about that produce unintended effects on third parties. Secondly, they must have a motivation. Now, the legacy motor vehicle firms were only motivated up to the point at which the legislation in different countries required them to behave. They were not motivated to go beyond that. People were still buying internal combustion engine motors, and still are, so they'll still produce these things, but they'll accede to the legislation. But the difficult one, the third one, they must have a capability, a capacity to take action, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So, the lead firm must be aware that it's contributing to the externality. So yes, there are these information impossibilities and there is this limited calculative capacity, and yes, life is very busy for the executives in these firms doing what they're doing, trying to achieve some sense of economic efficiency in the global value chain. But they increasingly now in our modern world, when we're so attuned to SDGs and climate change and the way in which the more sociologic issues are intruding into our economic and business world, the firms need to be aware of other things. They need to be motivated, and that's going to depend on a lot of things like the relative power of stakeholders. So I'm sure you all see periodically when there's a shareholder meeting of a big corporate, there'll always be people in the shareholder group who will argue the case that yes, Qantas, we're not doing enough to use less fuels creating warming effects in the world, or Cathay Pacific, so we need to be more attuned to what we're doing when we fly big aeroplanes all around the world. They must have a capability to act. Now this is a really tough one because every member in a global value chain certainly has a capability to do what they're contracted to do. If you're producing running shoes for Nike, it's a very competitive market. So you are at the top of your game if you've got contracts to produce those running shoes. So yes, you do have a capability to do the things that you're contracted to do. But the capability to act and to reconfigure a global value chain is something very different. And look what Tesla is going through these days. Look at the changes that are happening in your parts of the world, and particularly with the requirements to produce battery technologies and so on. look at the change in the whole nature of the construction of an electric vehicle compared to an internal combustion vehicle with these platform systems that are being touted. So that's what we mean by the capability to act and to change the configuration of the global value chain. It seems that you need to change the configuration of the chain to eliminate some of these negative externalities. If you don't change the configuration of the whole chain, the externality probably will still exist. And all you'll be doing is operating up to the requirements that legislation asks you to do. Not all global value chains have a powerful firm that's in a position to be able to do this, to carry out this orchestration role. And that's evidenced particularly in the ocean pollution problem. It's been around a long time. I come from Australia. We get stuff washing up on the beaches in Australia from other parts of the world too. So there are regular activities to clean the beaches. Well, that's pretty hard on an island the size of Australia, but people do it. And in other words, what's going on somewhere else in the world is producing an externality effect, even in a country like Australia, with rubbish washing up on the beach. So you can imagine what's happening in the small Pacific Island countries, where you've got big populations on either side of you producing lots of things that end up on their beaches. And they don't have populations who are able to clean their beaches as other countries do. So some global value chains do not have a lead firm that is anywhere near motivated. So in the ocean pollution case, one could propose that that lead firm would be a major global packaging firm. Are there major global packaging firms that are saying, we're not going to produce plastic packaging anymore? I mean, look, you go into a supermarket anywhere in the world and look how much plastic packaging there still exists. And I know for a fact there is technology to produce plastics biodegradably. There was a small firm in Australia that was producing plastics that biodegraded. Why aren't the big firms producing plastics or forms of packaging that are biodegradable? So where did all this start? Where did all this thinking about this external? I'll tell you where it started. It started with my interest in a small Australian agricultural firm called Technico Tubers that produced a smart potato, a seed potato that's no bigger than a match head. And this seed potato is not genetically modified. It's not GMO. It produces potatoes that carry no diseases into future generations, so there's very little waste, and you can grow this potato to any size you want. So can you imagine if you can fill those cylinders with potato crisps, with potatoes that are that perfect size, how revolutionary that is? Well, this firm can do it. And it won its first contract with PepsiCo Frito-Lay in China to do exactly that, to grow potatoes big enough to fit those cylinders of potato crisps, no waste. The world doesn't grow potatoes from Technico Tuber smart potatoes, but one wonders why don't we see more potatoes? Because there's phenomenal waste in growing potatoes. I don't know what it's like in Hong Kong, but the big supermarkets in Australia just won't accept a potato that's not unblemished. So here are some of the figures. Around the world, 1.3 billion tonnes of food is wasted every year. In Australia, 3.1 million tonnes, or in the old form, 17,747 jets full of food is wasted. 70% of the world's fresh water is used for agriculture. In Australia, 25% of agricultural produce remains on the farm. And Australia is a very, very efficient agricultural producer. But even then, 25% of all the agricultural products produced in Australia never get to market. They're wasted. In the US, about 40% of all food produced is wasted. In the world, 30%, about a third of all the food that's produced is wasted. And we talk about food insecurity. It's a big problem. But Technico Tubers was a little firm that produced a smart potato that eliminated all of those blemished potatoes that would have remained on the farms using a huge amount of water, and Australia is a water-starved continent. A huge amount of water is used in growing potatoes in Australia, and a lot of it just sits on the farm and wasted or fed to animals. Probably these days less fed to animals, but just ploughed back into the soil. IKEA. Well, we all know IKEA. A lot of people buy IKEA, some people don't. In Australia, students buy a lot of IKEA furniture. And when they finish their degree or leave their apartment at the end of the year, guess where the IKEA furniture ends up? Because it's probably broken or it's in poor shape. It ends up on the footpath because there are regular collection activities to take waste like that to the dumps in Australia. Who pays for that? Me, the taxpayer, who pays my rates on my house, right? So that's an externality effect. IKEA is generating externality effects all over the world through their broken furniture that ends up in landfill. There's no lead firms that are going to solve, seemingly at this stage, the plastic waste problem in oceans. IKEA, finally, I don't know whether it happens in other countries, but at least it happens in, they've created a new as-is department in their retail stores in Australia. So if you've got IKEA furniture and you don't want to use it anymore, you're a student and you're finished studying and you go back home, you can take it to IKEA, and if it's in reasonable shape, they'll buy it from you and sell it as second-hand furniture. So IKEA has realised they're creating an externality effect, and they have a social conscience to a degree. So that's another example of a firm that has internalised that social conscience and has said, yes, we are producing an externality, a negative externality. All those Australian ratepayers who are paying rates on the houses to collect waste on the footpath, some of which is IKEA, are unhappy about IKEA furniture on footpaths. Tesla, we don't need to say any more about Tesla. The firms that are leading here have an awareness, a motivation and a capability. A few words about positive externalities. Right? We can talk a lot about negative externalities. Maybe it's the positive ones that produce all of these opportunities that we keep talking about but we don't realise upon. In the past, we've always relied on government policy, such as subsidised R&D, to produce positive externalities in firms. Like we know how important it is for monies to be poured into our pharmaceutical sectors to produce new molecular structures to create new medications and drugs. However, we also know that some of those molecular structures can be used to produce new materials for construction. So that's interesting. That's a positive externality. And we also know that firms aren't going to do this unless they've got protection of their intellectual property, which is a big issue. And we also know that those firms that manage to protect their IP are going to monopolise that. Well, that's not a good thing from the arguments I'm putting, because we want these technologies diffused throughout the sector. But they're not going to be diffused if there's this monopolisation of IP. But we know that there are positive externalities that are being created, most of which are not being realised. So I'll summarise here. We've got positive externalities in production, such as R&D in the value chain, in battery technology and so on, that's going to have a lot of positive externality effects in other sectors once that technology is nailed. There are positive externalities in consumption, such as the improved environmental conditions we all experience if there's no pollution in the atmosphere from internal combustion motor vehicle engines. We know there are negative externalities in production, the pollution that's created, and the market power. The market power of the orchestrating firms is a negative externality. There are negative externalities in consumption, such as the adverse effects on people taking up motor vehicles and city congestion. I don't need to talk about that in Hong Kong. So there are a lot of different externality effects. But we believe that this is, in the first instance, these are problems that can potentially be solved by firms. So we provide private mechanisms to address negative externalities in the internationalisation of production. So what we're saying is, If we can create that awareness, if we can motivate and we can ensure the capacity, the capability in firms to ameliorate some of these negative externalities, we are best positioned rather than relying on government legislation. But there'll always be government legislation there to pick up on residual effects, one of which I'll talk about in a minute. So what are the difficulties of relying on public policy to do this? Firstly, there are measurement difficulties in cross-border transacting. We live in an integrated world, but every country's got its own legislation. There's limited scope of influence of any one government and the necessity of collaboration of all other governments. It'd be wonderful if we had transnational agreements that we all acceded to ameliorate some of these, like ocean pollution, but we don't have that. The reaction speed of public policy is very limited. It takes a long time. Look how long it had taken governments to build legislation to progress this emissions control in motor vehicle industry. And the law relevant to GVCs and the externalities remains underdeveloped. I mean, to negotiate legal arrangements between countries seems to be one of our enduring problems. So it does seem that some mix of private and public action needs necessary, with the voluntary action by firms. IKEA chose to create a second-hand division. Tesla put a lot of money and angst into the sector to create electric vehicles, which has now revolutionised the whole sector. Little Technico tubers produced a seed potato that revolutionised producing potatoes to eliminate huge amounts of waste in a country that relies on water but pours a lot of water on potato farms to be wasted. So what is the role for government? There is a big role for government, and I think the Tesla story highlights that. I think at the outset there is a role for government in incentivising the emergence of new firms. And it's always been there. New firms are usually the firms that revolutionise sectors. Entrepreneurial behaviour in firms, Technico tubers with their seed potatoes, Tesla with its motor cars. We don't have a new firm that's emerging in the food production sector globally to eliminate more waste in food. We don't have a packaging firm that's emerging in any sense to eliminate plastic waste that ends up in the oceans. So the agency of global value chain members is crucial in self-correction, but there will always be residual effects there for governments and public policy. So I haven't put this on a slide, but what are the implications for us as a field? It's a bit of déjà vu, isn't it? If the economics of the day, post-Second World War, could not explain the multinational and what it was doing overseas with FDI, and that led to the spawning of a new field called international business, if IB cannot theorise well what's going on in global value chains and solve some of these enduring problems that big multinationals are allegedly compliant with, then maybe some other field might take that initiative. And I always have this concern that fields like organisation science and so on might have the potential to take some of our ground from us as an IB field. And this is important because our domain is the organisation of international production, however that is done. And it's now done in the global value chain. So I'll finish. Thank you.